Hello everybody, and welcome. This is the first video I'll be doing in a series about my upcoming video game. If you're new to this channel, welcome. It's great to have you here. If you're not new, I know this is very different than the type of videos I usually make, but I hope you'll stick around anyway. Alright, so I've been working on this game for about a month and a half now. I don't have any programming experience or art skills or honestly really any of the things that you need to make a good game, but I started learning game development a couple of months ago. It's something I've always been interested in doing, but honestly I was always just too scared of code to actually try it out. But after following a bunch of tutorials and doing a couple of small side projects, I eventually realized it's not that bad, and I jumped into making this project. So this game started pretty small and very simple. The basic idea was just to make some sort of top-down game where you would sail around as a ship and shoot at some enemies, and that was pretty much it at first. But as I kept working on it, I kept having new ideas constantly popping in my head, and as I slowly started to add them one by one to the project, I figured I might as well just go ahead and make this a full game. So at this point in the development, I pretty much have all of the very basic core mechanics of the game working, and that'll be the focus of this video. The next step for me is to start building out the actual world and do some level design. And I've already done a little bit of that, which I'll touch on at the end of the video, but that'll be the focus for the next devlog. Alright, so the first step for me to actually start this process was to open up Unity, which is a fantastic engine to be using at the moment, and just plop in a blue plane to act as the water. And I also liberated some free pirate ship models that I found online. And to set up the player movement, I didn't want it to be some super complex game with, realistic sailing mechanics where you have to take into account the wind direction and water current and all those types of things. I've played games before that do those sorts of things, and while I do think they're great, it's not really what I'm going for with this game, and also honestly I'm too dumb to be implementing that anyway. I did, however, want the player to feel just a little bit restricted in terms of movement. I do want it to actually feel like you're sailing and there's some resistance from the water. So I wrote some code that would detect what direction you're trying to travel in. You can think of this as just, whatever direction the joystick of a controller is tilted in, for example. The script will then just rotate the player towards whatever that direction is using Unity's wonderfully named slurp function. Then I just apply a force to the player in whatever direction the ship is currently facing, and this creates a really simple but really nice sailing movement. Next, I wanted to give the player some other type of movement option, so I stole an idea from basically every other game and added a dash. This one is also pretty simple. You just press the dash button and the ship gets a little burst of speed. I actually later ended up changing this to more of a stamina mechanic because, like everyone else, I have to steal from Breath of the Wild, but at first this was just a dash. Next was the process of figuring out how to make the player shoot cannonballs. For this, I wrote another script that detects whenever the player presses the fire button, and then the game will just spawn in a cannonball that shoots out from the left and the right side of the player ship. At first, you were able to just spam the fire button and shoot a ridiculous amount of cannonballs, which made the game way too easy and cluttered and gross. So I just added a really simple timer so the player can only fire once every couple seconds. And with all those things done, that was pretty much all of the player controls finished. Alright, so at this point the player is done, but there's not actually a game. There's nothing to actually do. So the next step was to add some enemies. I wrote the enemy script to follow a pretty simple state machine. It starts off by just sailing towards the player in what I've called a chase mode. Then whenever the distance between the enemy and the player is below a certain threshold, it'll switch into attack mode. And there it will just circle around the player so its sides are facing you, and it'll just keep shooting. And obviously for this to actually do anything, I needed to add a health system so the ships can actually damage each other. This was also pretty simple. It was just a matter of assigning a health value to the player and the enemies, and then decreasing that value whenever a ship collides with a cannonball. Now, it was actually pretty tricky to get this working properly. At first I had a few issues where the enemies would damage other enemies, or the ships would spawn cannonballs inside their own hitbox and literally just shoot themselves to death. But I was able to fix this by just making the cannonballs keep track of whether it was the player or an enemy that spawned it, and then only damage whatever it hits if the target isn't the same thing. So basically, cannonballs fired by the player can only hurt enemies, and cannonballs fired by the enemies can only hurt the player. So next up was figuring out some sort of system to keep spawning in enemies once they've died. And for this I wrote a script to continuously spawn in waves of enemies, and I set it up so that I can control how many enemies spawn for each wave and what type of enemy it is, so that later when I have lots of different enemy types, I can easily implement them. The wave system pretty much works exactly as you'd expect. Defeat all the enemies on the screen, and then the next wave of enemies will spawn. Pretty simple. This was also my first time using random number generation, which was a bit confusing for me at first, but eventually understood it. I set the spawn system up so that there's a few different points on the map which have beautiful gray spheres, and whenever the wave spawner adds an enemy, it will randomly pick one of those points and spawn in that location. So with the player movement set up, the enemies working, and the wave system set up, I pretty much had a complete basic game finished. And as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of what I'd set out to make originally, but as I kept playing it and testing it, I thought the game was pretty fun, and I thought it had a lot of potential, so I just kept adding features. So if I was going to turn this into a real game, it's probably worth taking a closer look at the graphics and the art style for this thing, because right now it's not it. Now, I'm not an artist, and I don't really have artistic skills, nor do I have the desire to learn 3D modeling right now, but luckily there's resources out there for small game developers like me to purchase pre-made art assets for relatively cheap. I found a pirate-themed art pack on Unity's asset store that I really liked the look of. It was a little bit tricky at first to convert things over to the new art pack because I was an idiot, and for whatever reason I decided to scale the previous ship models down to 1/10 of the size they should have been. So basically I had to redo all of the math for the game, but good lord, this is such a huge improvement, it was worth it. This is probably the best decision I've made so far throughout the whole development process. Now with the art style figured out and the graphics looking a ton better, it was time for me to add some more depth to the actual gameplay. So I'll be honest, it took me a very long time to fully implement the shop mechanic. A shop seems really simple on the surface, but there's so many different systems that I had to build behind the scenes to get it to work properly and for it to include all the features that I wanted it to. And I'm still not fully done with it. There's lots more that I want to add to it, but I think the basics now are really solid. But to get it all working, there was so much I had to do. You have to have a gold system, which required writing a script so that enemies would drop gold whenever they die. Then I had to write another script so that the player would add a certain value of gold when they pick it up to their gold count. Then I had to figure out a data saving system so that the game can actually keep track of how much gold you have and what upgrades you've purchased, so that your progress isn't just completely lost whenever you exit the game. Then I had to set up multiple ship types for you to buy. Then there was setting up different tiers of sails and hulls for you to purchase. Then there's keeping track of the number of cannons each ship has, and all of those upgrades have to also update the player's visuals so you're controlling the right ship with the right type of sails, with the right hull color, with the right number of cannons, and the player's cannon firing script has to know exactly how many cannons you've bought and only shoot that exact number of cannonballs, and purchasing any upgrade has to remove the correct amount of gold from the player's gold count. And I also had to figure out how to set up an entire UI system so that you can actually buy stuff and interact with it, and I had to set up a small island where the shop actually sits and change the camera view, and it was just a lot. And there were so many bugs I encountered throughout the entire process of setting it up that I really honestly got pretty close to just abandoning the project and thinking I was a complete failure and an idiot. But after following some tutorials and doing a ton of Google searches and just continuing to hammer away at it, I actually got it working. And I'm super proud of how it turned out, and I'm really proud of myself for sticking through it. Having the shop adds a ton of depth to the gameplay, and it gives the player a reason to continue playing. I also learned so much from the whole process, and I can honestly say my programming ability has drastically improved through trying to set up just that one mechanic. So at this point, I'm at a state where I've got a game where you can sink enemy ships, plunder their gold, spend the gold on even more powerful ships and upgrades, sink even more enemies, get more gold, and so on. And that's a pretty nice gameplay loop, and I feel pretty good about all of the core systems that I've got going. Alright, so I think that's where I'll leave off for this video. That pretty much covers all of the basic core mechanics of the game, and a lot of the work that I've already done so far. In the next video, I'll show some of the levels and environments I've been working on, and also how I plan to structure the rest of the game. If you've got any suggestions or thoughts or comments or ideas, really anything at all, just go ahead and leave a comment below, and let me know what you think. Thanks for watching!